acceptance criteria, and evaluation criteria. These are just a form of requirement that must be met to give a solution, feature, or a functionality a pass or fail. You should expect to do this a lot as a BA as it is core to writing requirements. The IIBA lumps acceptance criteria and evaluation criteria together, but I find them to be somewhat distinct. Acceptance criteria are typically used for something to be developed, like a user story in a sprint or requirement in a requirements document. What you should be thinking when documenting acceptance criteria is how can you document how a successful functionality will work for all the people who have a role in its success. This would be the business stakeholders and end users who need to clearly understand what will be built so that they can provide feedback and approval to make sure it'll meet their needs. Any designers who need to make sure their design meets the needs, any developers who will be doing the building, and testers who will be validating that it is accurate and ready for production. There are many ways to document acceptance criteria, and the important thing is to document them in a way that meets the needs of the requirement. For example, acceptance criteria for a data interface might be written in a way that defines data fields, how they are communicated, and performance requirements. Functional acceptance criteria might be written in Gherkin or given when with then to better document the actions and expected reactions of a feature. It should be noted that organizations or teams may refer to acceptance criteria with different words, like maybe validation criteria, or maybe they use different concepts to ensure that acceptance criteria is documented by enforcing different concepts like use cases, which are functionally very similar to using Gherkin. The key is ultimately that the requirement is testable. Evaluation criteria is more common when you are comparing features of different software that you are potentially acquiring. The key for a business analyst when creating evaluation criteria, as well as actually evaluating potential solutions, is to avoid shiny object syndrome. Your goal is to keep people focused on why they are acquiring new software or hardware, because once you start getting into the potential offerings, you will be presented with all kinds of fun and interesting features that may distract you from your ultimate goal. This technique can actually be very valuable in your personal life when making big decisions like buying a car, a home, accepting a job offer, and so on. So here's a quick example of how that might look. In this quick evaluation criteria spreadsheet that I created, I included our evaluation criteria. This is for a car, so it's a little bit more simple than you might see in an evaluation that might have come from like a BRD or something like that. But conceptually, it's the same, and it demonstrates what you'd be doing. So here, if you look at my criteria, they're pretty straightforward, and most of them are somewhat numerical or quantitative in nature. You know, how fast it is, can it get to 0 to 60 in under a certain amount of time, how fuel efficient it is, miles per gallon, capacity, number of seats, trunk space, etc. Then you see I've categorized this criteria. If when you're doing this for something that might have come from a BRD, you might categorize these based off of business requirements or business capabilities that were in the original BRD, or maybe by different business functions. And the goal is really for somebody who's looking at this, especially somebody who's a stakeholder, to be able to look at the categories and kind of just determine which categories are likely to be the most important to them, to make it really easier for them to find the criteria that are most important to them. In this case, in purchasing a car, now that I'm older, I'm married with kids, I like to drive a little bit fast, so I might care about performance, whereas my kids or my wife might care more about the capacity. How much trunk space does it have? How many seats it has? You get the idea. And then as we continue on with the sheet, you can see I have a little scoring section down here at the bottom. That's just so you can understand how I'm going to be scoring each of the different vehicles, which are a station wagon, a family SUV, a performance SUV, and a sport sedan. And I chose to do this using a numerical scoring system. 0 meeting does not meet, aka if you don't meet the requirement at all, then you shouldn't get any points towards your final score. If you meet it, your point range is in the middle, and if you exceed it, you give it a 5. You could actually do this however you want, for whatever way makes sense for the project you're on and the type of criteria that you're evaluating. You could have used the numbers from 0 to 5, 0 to 10. You could have made it binary like true, false, or 1, 0. It just, whatever works for the type of situation that you're in. But I was in a rush when I created this, and this numerical system worked best for me. And then you can see here that I scored each of these vehicles based off of whether kind of an estimation. I had a vehicle in mind when I was doing this, and I kind of made up the numbers for the sake of the demonstration. But you could imagine whatever specific vehicle that you feel, meets these titles here. So a station wagon, you're kind of low to the ground, smaller than shorter than a minivan. In height, but sometimes longer. The family SUV, which is your big vehicle. Sometimes it could be 3-row, but not always. Your performance SUV. This is really when you're getting into those like luxury offerings that give you a little more kick. And then the sports sedan, which is obviously a 2 or 4-door car with likely not more than 5 seats that can get up and go. Now, the key to being successful when creating evaluation criteria is column C, the weight and priority. And this is how you avoid that shiny object syndrome that I talked about when I introduced the concept of evaluation criteria. Here is where you evaluate how much or how important each of these criteria are, right? So, like I said, right now at this point in my life, I have kids, I'm married. So some of these things are going to be more important than others. With kids, you have a lot of expenses. So how much something costs is going to matter to me more than maybe how fast the car goes, because why should I be driving that fast when I have my whole family in the car? And then there's some things that are much more critical. For example, trunk space. If I have kids who are doing a lot of extracurricular activities, that have a lot of equipment, or maybe I need to be able to fit that double stroller into the trunk. If it doesn't fit, then the car is not going to work, because what am I going to do when I get there if I don't have that stroller with me, right? And so I've weighted the trunk space the highest, ability to seat 5, which is your standard 2-row car. Obviously, if it exceeds expectations with a 3rd row, that would be even better. But at minimum, it needs to have those 2 rows of seats so I could fit everybody that needs to fit in the car. So as we walk through kind of what is documented here, you can see that with the raw scores, you get an idea of what the scores might have been. And something that is really well highlighted with this example is when you look at the scores, if you look at, for example, the station wagon raw score versus the sports sedan, it would seem as though that the sports sedan, if I had to evaluate them or rank these, is going to rank better than the station wagon, with the station wagon being at the bottom. But this is prior to the scores being weighted, meaning that the things that are most important are not showing as more valuable. So if you look at the sports sedan, it's the fastest car. It goes really fast, apparently. And so it got a really high score on that. But that's not a super important criteria. And then on top of that, I use some negative weight and priority, meaning if the numbers are too high here, I want the score to be knocked down, right? So you could do that by creating a negative weight here. And then here you can see that it's actually doing pretty poorly in terms of the cost of the car itself, as well as the 5-year maintenance estimate, which when you have a big family, you have a lot of expenses. You don't want a lot of unnecessary expenses. And so it lost some points there. So you can see that without the prioritization, without that weight, it's the bottom. But then when you look at the weighted scores, you can see that across the board, this is actually the number 2 pick. It's not super fast, but in terms of capacity, in terms of trunk space, in terms of fuel economy, it's actually doing really well. And those are the most important categories that I have on the sheet, similarly to the family SUV. And then when you look at the performance SUV, that you would have maybe thought would have scored similarly to the family SUV, because in theory, it's just a similar vehicle. One is just faster and more powerful. But oftentimes when you look at, performance vehicles that are meant to go fast and kind of be belligerent, if you will, oftentimes, one, they cost a lot more. You're paying for that extra performance. And then oftentimes they also have a higher maintenance cost, because the different parts and pieces to make it go super fast are also more expensive. And therefore, the weight comes down. So when you look at the score for the performance SUV, it's not even that much different from its raw score. Whereas when you look at the raw versus weighted score of the station wagon and family SUV, both of those are quite high. So when you rank them based off of the weighted scores, you can see that the family SUV actually wins, followed by the station wagon, followed by the performance SUV, followed by the sports sedan. And obviously, based on your actual needs, you could adjust the numbers. When I was, 25 years old, I probably would have weighted, performance a lot higher, and capacity of truck space, a lot less. In fact, at one point in my life, I even drove a Mini Cooper, so I'm sure that would have failed pretty badly on a lot of these, minus, the quickness and miles per gallon. It was actually pretty fuel efficient. And so you can see that based on the actual needs and the actual priorities of the organization, different software can come out differently, whether they have a feature or not, or meet or exceed certain capabilities, and not just whether they can do it or not, but what the priority is. And for you as a business analyst, a lot of the work you're going to be doing is working with your stakeholders to actually determine the weight and priority of these things. And it's not going to be you; it's going to be them who's going to really be telling you how important these things are. Like, what's our budget for the software? Who's going to be using the software? What are the pain points in the organization today that might make a certain feature higher than the other? And as you go through, it is possible that you might find new features that you didn't even know existed in the current new cars that weren't available the last time you purchased a car. And that just means you have to add a row for that, and maybe reevaluate some of the things based off of that criteria that you might find become a priority because it solves your problem better than maybe something you came up with off the bat. So it's kind of a work in progress. You adjust and as you learn. That was my quick walkthrough on acceptance criteria and evaluation criteria. If you found that helpful or useful, give me a thumbs up. If you have any additional questions about this concept or any other BA techniques, let me know in the comments and I'll either answer you there or create a new video to answer your questions. So subscribe to see your questions get answered. And as always, thanks for watching.